We have seen why the Roman Colosseum was a marvel of technology by any measure. The stands were carefully designed to reflect class-ruled Roman society. Crowd control was not an afterthought. It was an important design consideration. Elevators could move huge animals. Aqueducts could pipe in massive quantities of water on demand. But the reputation of the Colosseum does not rest on its engineering prowess. The legend was inspired by the men who fought and died within its walls, the gladiators. But in the same way that legend has obscured the real story of the Colosseum, so too has legend obscured the real story of the gladiators. Most people imagine gladiatorial combat as a fight to the death, and that all gladiators were basically the same, armed with a sword and shield. But historical evidence paints a different picture. There were in fact many different specialized forms of gladiators, each waging his own special form of combat. The most common combatant was the Murmillo. Based on the Roman legionary, he was heavily armored with a long curved rectangular shield, the scutum, a short sword, padded protection on his right arm, and a short leg protector, or greave, on his left leg. The secutor was a variant on the Murmillo, differing only in his helmet, which was less ornate, and the eye holes, which were much smaller. The Hoplomachus, based on a Greek soldier, bore a small round shield, a long lance, and 2 high greaves. The Threx had a medium-sized squared shield, greaves to the knees, and a curved sword. The strangest fighter of all was the Retiarius, with no protection aside from a shoulder shield. His weapons were paltry: a net, a trident, and a short dagger. What were their fights like? Unsolved History's investigation begins with a painting, one that has molded our perception of gladiatorial combat more than any other image. In 1872, French painter Jean-Léon Gérôme created this famous work, Pollice Verso. Gérôme made every effort to get the historical details right. Most people think he succeeded. In fact, this image inspired the look of the film Gladiator. Unsolved History will put Gérôme's depiction to the test.
When we look at Gérôme's interpretation, we see 2 sections of seats in the lower portion of the Colosseum, but there should actually be 4. The emperor here is sitting in his grand chair, and yet no netting that surely would be there to protect him.
If the seating arrangement is wrong, perhaps we should look closer at Gérôme's rendition of gladiatorial combat.
It appears that it's a mass combat in which the sole survivor, the last man standing, is the victor.
Was this the way gladiators fought?
The victorious gladiator now glances up at the first row of Vestal virgins who are gesticulating the Pollice Verso, which is the Latin term for turned thumb.
Gérôme translated turn thumb as thumbs down, but that was just a guess. Did Romans ever make this now famous gesture? To help unravel these mysteries, Unsolved History will travel through the mists of time and attempt to see gladiators the way Romans did.
Gladiatorial combat was very, very professional, and the gladiators were highly trained. One should think of it perhaps in terms of the modern boxer or the fencer.
Military historian Marcus Junkelmann knows more about gladiatorial combat than anyone since Roman times. He's even created his own troupe of fighters. This practical research gives him an insight that history books lack.
The normal impression that gladiator combat in the arena was a mess, was a chaotic melee of dozens of fighters and all against all and without rules is completely wrong.
Contrary to popular depictions, a referee would always be close at hand, and only 2 gladiators would fight at a time. The Romans also had specific formulas for pairing types of gladiators.
This is a classic couple of large shield men, the Momillo against the small shield man, the Trax or Thracian. The Momillo is very well protected in front of him, while the Thracian with his small shield will circle around him to get into his flank. And he has a curved sword. He can try to stab around or beneath the shield of his adversary.
The Murmillo could also battle the Hoplomachus, whose extra reach with a long lance was balanced out by his weaker defense, a small round shield. Some gladiator types, like the Equus and the Provocator, were pitched against fighters of the same type, but the Romans seemed to love odd pairings.
The Retiarius is the most lightly armed type of gladiator, only protected by a small bronze shield on his left shoulder. And his weapons are a net with which he tries to overthrow his adversary, and then following up the attack with his trident, always keeping his enemy at a distance, while his heavily armored pursuer is seeking the infight. His strength is hand-to-hand combat, always the left shoulder with a shield in front. This combination of heavy gladiator and a very swift light gladiator was thought by the Romans to be the most thrilling type of fighting, and therefore it became the most popular.
The net fighter only stood a chance if he could tire his heavily armed and visually blinded opponent. The Retiarius was the perfect underdog, one that Romans loved to see prevail. Above all, the Romans wanted to see a good fight. So they made sure the most vulnerable part of the gladiator, the face, was well protected with a visor.
I think that the visor, which takes away your personality and makes you almost like an impersonal monster, to make a fighter more aggressive, to attack his enemy in a worse manner than he did when he would see his face.
But how did the duels end? It turns out that it was not always with the death of one of the combatants.
The scale of bloodshed is extraordinarily exaggerated. About 20% of the fights ended with a death, 90% survived.
Many combats ended in a draw, both gladiators walking wounded from the arena. But if one man could no longer keep up the fight...
Then he dropped his shield and raised his left hand with a finger stretched out. In that moment, his adversary was no longer allowed to attack him.
The decision on whether a defeated gladiator should live or die was now in the hands of the men who had paid for the games, and the influence of public opinion. If the crowd felt the loser had fought well and hard, they would urge his pardon.
People made a fist with the thumb pressed on and cried, "Missum." Then he was beaten but alive and could leave.
But if the crowd judged him a coward, or he was too badly injured to recover, this would be his end.
He had to accept this as a death sentence, like an execution. He had to kneel down and, without showing any emotion, awaited the death blow by his adversary, who stabbed him normally into the throat.
And what of the famous turned thumb? Our historical evidence points to an alternate gesture. Not thumbs down, but the thumb pointed to the throat, mimicking the final, deadly blow of the victor's sword. Unsolved History's investigation into the real Roman games has dispelled another myth. We're ready to travel back in time and see what a day at the Colosseum would really be like. From dawn to dusk at the spectacle of bloodshed.